The final item of business is a members' business debate on motion 16637 in the name of Claudia Beamish on Towards an Independent Palestinian State, a Scottish proposal. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put. Can I ask those members who wish to take part in the debate to press their request to speak buttons now? And I call on Claudia Beamish to open the debate. Ms Beamish, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I am saddened to have to bring my motion to the Chamber this afternoon, but relieved that this opportunity has been created to debate the grave situation created for the people of Palestine and commit to supporting a just way forward, one which benefits Palestinians and Israelis alike. I thank my colleagues who have signed the motion for debate. This motion recognises the historic responsibility of the United Kingdom in Palestine and Israel and acknowledges the fundamental role that Scotland, its people and its government has and can play in promoting principles rooted in equality, justice and the rule of law. To fully grasp the degree to which Britain was involved in the making, or better said, the unmaking, of the Palestinian state, we must first remember the historic conditions that made it happen. The roots of conflict date back to the late 19th century, when Palestine was still part of the Ottoman Empire, and Jewish nationalism, political Zionism, developed in Europe, largely in response to the pogroms in the Russian Empire. We should never forget either the century-long history of virulent anti-Semitism throughout Christian Europe. In 1917, a statement from the UK government, formerly known as the Balfour Declaration, largely driven by strategic wartime considerations, turned an aspiration of establishing a Jewish state in Palestine from an idealistic and unrealistic vision into a possibility, as Britain publicly pledged to establish a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine. It is worth remembering that at that time there were 600,000 Arabs and only 55,000 Jews living there, most of whom were indigenous and religious, non-Zionist and Arabic-speaking. In total, the Jewish community in Palestine owned less than 3% of the land. At the end of the First World War, Britain became the mandatory power in Palestine and deliberately ignored the clear wishes of the Arab majority who sought self-rule in accordance with Britain's responsibility to fulfill that sacred trust as specified in the League of Nations mandate. In 1937, the British government suggested partitioning Palestine but swiftly abandoned the idea as it was too problematic. By 1939, because of Hitler's persecution of the Jews, and the Jewish population had risen in Palestine sharply by about 30%, but they still owned only some 6% of the land. During the Second World War, Jewish militias turned on the British, their former sponsors, and ultimately in 1947, Britain, exhausted militarily and financially, surrendered to Zionist terror and handed the future of Palestine over to the United Nations. We abandoned Palestine, shabbily and shamefully. Zionist militias defeated the Arab armies, expelled most of the Palestinian population, Muslim and Christian, into the surrounding countries and established the State of Israel on 78% of the Palestinian land area. Sadly and shamefully, as we are all aware, that still is, sorry, I feel emotional about this. If we were only able to find a solution then, we wouldn't have had to wait 70 years, and surely we must find one now. Past British responsibility that still provokes present injustice demands British involvement to work urgently for a safe, brighter future for all the people in Israel and Palestine. Only by seeking and achieving equality of rights, peaceful coexistence between the citizens of Israel and Palestine, and the right to self-determination equally exercised, can there be a lasting security. A lasting security for one people does not come by suppressing the rights of the other. To achieve these universal values that Britain helped incorporate into international law, my motion calls for 6 measures to be taken, as proposed by the Balfour Project: an end to the closure of Gaza, which I visited in 2011 with my friend and colleague John Finney, and what we witnessed then has tragically deteriorated further for those struggling to bring up children there. True freedom of worship for all believers, Jews, Muslims and Christians at their holy sites. East Jerusalem is occupied Palestinian territory, and like the rest of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is the Palestinian state of which I speak today. Respect for the rule of law, The whole Israeli settler enterprise is indeed illegal in relation to the Fourth Geneva Convention. Furthermore, the International Court of Justice issued an advisory opinion regarding the legality of the Israeli wall in the West Bank, concluding the wall is contrary to international law. 4, accountability and consequences for whoever is responsible for continuously breaking international law without fear or favour. And 5, recognition by the UK government and other European states of the State of Palestine alongside Israel. In order for this to happen, in my view, we need a Labour government. And the Scottish Government, I'm sure, will be working for this as well. 6, the UK Government commitment to defend the fundamental rights of both peoples. Free, legitimate movement of goods and people between Gaza and West Bank is just one of these. In the Balfour Declaration, the British government pledged to protect the rights of the existing Arab population, and alas, we have broken our promise. The moment is now to show our support. In the direst of times, with the toxic mix of the Israeli government's deeply concerning politically military activity and the profoundly detrimental Trump administration. In 2 weeks, the people of Israel will vote in their general election. Prime Minister Netanyahu seeks the votes of Israeli settlers by promising to annex illegal settlements. Such a step, itself illegal, poses, in my view, an existential threat to the policy of two states and equal rights advocated by the British government and the EU. Recognition of Palestine and Palestinian rights is the right way to preempt and even prevent that very real threat. Make no mistake, annexation is actually a threat to the well-being of both peoples. For, if there were not to be two states, there would effectively be one state, one power. Tragically, that state would be an apartheid state. I am an optimist. I still believe there can be peaceful coexistence through mutual recognition and parallel self-determination. But history teaches us that this conflict cannot be resolved by the two parties by themselves. The disparity in power is too great between them. That is why I say what we do here and what we say matters. We can act or we can simply watch. I say we must act together for the good of all. Recognition of Palestine along with Israel does not delegitimize Israel. It takes nothing away from Israel, which belongs to Israel. Rather, it serves to confirm Israel's borders and her security. It also serves to establish Palestine's borders and her security, and affirms the equal rights of two peoples in statehood, each in their own country. Finally, it is my belief, and I hope the Chamber will agree today, that we must acknowledge the profound challenges ahead. And I ask today that we reaffirm the commitment of this Parliament to a just solution for the Palestinian and Israeli peoples, acknowledging the work of the Balfour Project and committing to working to help make the 6 measures I have highlighted today a reality. Thank you.
I call Sandra White to be followed by Bill Bowman. Ms White, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Can I congratulate Claudia Beanish, my colleague on the cross-party group on Palestine, for securing this debate and for such a wonderful, heartfelt speech as well. And I also want to welcome the people in the gallery and also thank them for the very hard work that they have carried out in regards to their support and also the work they've carried out on the Balfour Project, which was held here in Edinburgh, a meeting and event here in Edinburgh, and I believe there is going to be a book produced in regards to the submissions which myself, Claudia and others put into that event as well. Now, Claudia Beamish quite rightly said about the history of Palestine, and I've always been a great believer, as have many others, that you can't look to your future if you really don't know about your past. And Claudia gave us a very detailed issue and content of the past of what has happened to the Palestinian people and to the Middle East as well. So I won't dwell on all of that, but I think it is important that we recognise the fact that, yes, we have to recognise a Palestinian state, because after all, it was the British that petitioned that. And I'm proud to say that we in Scotland, and there's many people in the UK as well, who support a Palestinian state. But we're having this debate tonight in regards to a Palestinian state. Now, we know about the British mandate, as Claudia had mentioned, and we know about the Balfour Declaration, promised to establish in Palestine a national home for the Jewish people, essentially vowing to give away a country that was not theirs or ours to give away. And hence, this is what happened since, or it's got worse, actually. 47, the British government announced it would be handing Palestine over to the United Nations, as Claudia Beamish has said. November 29, 1947, the UN adopted Resolution 181, recommending the partition of Palestine to Jewish and Arab states, with a special international status for the city of Jerusalem. And we must remember that. That was a UN statement. And we have Trump, and we have what I would say a toothless UN. And you see the state of the West Bank and Gaza and the city of Jerusalem now as well. And it's timely that we need to act now. The proposals then were not acceptable. They went against the principles of self-determination and they imposed conditions on the Palestinian people which were absolutely unworkable. And as is today, they're still unworkable as well. But as I said, I think, and I think others do, you need to know your past before you can go forward to your future. But let's be clear, regardless of the history, there is a way forward. I believe there is a way forward. And the only way to achieve lasting peace is to recognise a Palestinian state alongside an Israeli one. That wasn't possible in 1947, but for myself and many, many others, it's the only viable option open to us now. Not just to us, but the Palestinian people as well, particularly the people who are imprisoned in Gaza, the largest open-air prison in the world. And that cannot be justice and that cannot be right. And we, as a parliament, we in Scotland as well, we can't continue to bury our heads in the sand. It's time for us, the UK, to join with other UN members who do recognise the state of Palestine. It's time that the British government, the UK government, recognise the state of Palestine. And if we in this parliament recognise the state of Palestine, that sends a huge message, not just to the UN, it sends a huge message throughout the world. From the time when Britain administered Palestine until it was abandoned in 1948, our position in Palestine has really, really been quite shameful. We do support, and we do support any UN efforts. As I said before, I think they're a toothless tiger, unfortunately, for a two-state solution, and it's something that we have to do. It's time for action. We've talked enough about it. It's time for action. So fully support the motion put forward by Claudia Beamish and my other colleagues who have supported it also, and to support the 6 measures mentioned in the motion. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Thank you very much. I call Bill Bowman, to be followed by Pauline McNeill. Mr. Bowman, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. First, let me thank Claudia Beamish for bringing forward this debate. I have visited Israel and the West Bank twice, the most recent time being summer 2018, as part of the Building Bridges with Israel cross-party group trip that was organised for MSPs. As has been outlined by colleagues, the Israel-Palestine issue has been a prominent conflict in the international arena for decades. And since 2005, when, despite Israeli disengagement from the Gaza Strip, Palestinian terrorist group Hamas won control of the Strip and deposed the Palestinian Authority in a violent coup. This action was further exacerbated by Hamas's refusal to acknowledge calls by the US, the EU, and the Middle East Quartet to recognise Israel, accept all previously signed agreements and give up arms. And to this day, it insists on using terror against Israel to gain control over its entire territory. Now, let me get on a little bit, I think, with my points. Thank you. There are 6 measures mentioned in the motion, and I will attempt to touch on each of these during my speech. First, an end to the closure of Gaza. In 2005, Israel unilaterally disengaged from the Gaza Strip and dismantled all its settlements there. This could have been a victory for the Palestinians, but instead, in the year following, Hamas won control over the Gaza Strip and deposed the Palestinian Authority in a coup. To this day, it insists on using terror against Israel to gain control over its entire territory. Not at the moment. Thank you.
Sit down, please. The member's not taking interventions. No point saying it.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. Second, true freedom of worship for all believers, Jewish, Muslim and Christian, at their holy sites in Jerusalem, which must be the shared capital of 2 states. Now, religious freedom and religious holidays are enshrined by constitutional legislation in Israel. Freedom of access and worship is ensured at all sites, and that's certainly what I saw when I was there. These facts are perhaps unsurprising, as Israel is consistently ranked as the freest country in the Middle East. These facts stand in stark contrast to the West Bank and Gaza. When it comes to holy places, Jews have little to no access to religious sites in the West Bank. Third, respect for the rule of law embodied in UN Security Council resolutions. Israel has accepted UN Security Council Resolution 242 and made peace with both Egypt and Jordan based on it. In both instances, Israel returned land for peace and uprooted Israeli settlements. Israel has in fact offered blueprints for a two-state solution between itself and the Palestinians, but was rejected by the Palestinians. Fourth, accountability and serious consequences for breaking international law. The High Court of Justice of Israel is renowned worldwide for its judicial independence, and it has ruled many times against Israeli government decisions. In the meantime, Hamas violates international humanitarian law by targeting civilians with its missiles, using its own civilians, including children, as human shields, and hiding its arsenals in heavily populated areas, including schools. Fifth, UK government commitment to defend fundamental rights of both peoples, including their right to security. No, I just want to get my points made, thank you. People who care about the fundamental rights of both peoples too often ignore those human rights violations of Palestinians by Palestinians. Despite being legally mandated, no national elections have taken place in the Palestinian territories since 2006. Mahmoud Abbas was elected President of the National Authority on January 2005 for a 4-year term ending in 2009. The last elections to the Palestinian Legislative Council were held in January 2006. The Palestinian people, therefore, are prevented from choosing their representatives by their own leadership. Finally, a key issue is that of recognition by the UK government and European partners of the State of Palestine alongside Israel. Recognising a Palestinian state without it arising from direct negotiations between the two parties will harm the peace process and drive the Palestinians away from the negotiating table. It will reward the Palestinians for their rejectionism and eliminate any incentives they have to compromise on key issues that are critical in the negotiations. Anyone who claims to support a two-state solution must support a return to direct negotiations, which are the only way to guarantee a peaceful, secure and prosperous future for the region, as I'm sure we all would like. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Bowman. I call Polly McNeill to be followed by John Finney. Ms McNeill, please.
The question of Palestine is the story of a people without a land. In fact, kicked out of their land in a very violent struggle. It is a simple story of colonial dispossession and ethnic cleansing. Some people, like Bill Bowman, don't want to recognise the historical and recorded facts on the history of Palestine because you need and want to create a narrative to defend the Israel that you saw. And clearly you didn't see anything, Mr Bowman, of the brutal elements of the occupation, which has now been 53 years, the longest military occupation in history. The world treats it like a multifaceted, complex story. It demonises the struggle, as the member has just done, because only Israel could possibly understand this complex story. Israel got 78% of former Palestine, but the Palestinians were given 22%, which has been occupied since 1967. It is not a conflict about religion. It is a struggle for national identity of the Palestinian people, who all they want to do is achieve a sovereign, independent state of their own, and it's our responsibility to champion that. We're no further forward, in fact, decades on than we were. No hope for the Palestinians, no hope for a future. And 20 years of peace talks turns out, I think, to be a sham. Interestingly, Mr Bowman, who blames the Palestinian leadership, I met with members of the Knesset. I was an observer in the election, and some of the members were good enough to admit that they deliberately humiliated Yasser Arafat, who'd laid down arms in order to provide a peaceful solution for the Palestinians, and the people, rightly or wrongly, voted for Hamas in 2006. So it doesn't matter what the Palestinian leadership do. There's always a reason not to grant them their state. But the state that we talk about is a state of occupation and day and daily. Children are shot in the street for throwing stones. In fact, interestingly, It was the Jewish leader Henry Sigmund, who is the former head of the American Jewish Congress, said that it is Israel that is preventing a Palestinian state. He said millions of Palestinians live in a subservient position, without rights, without security, without hope and without a future. Palestinians only want the same as Israeli Jews want, as you would expect. I'm actually proud that a Labour government has said that if they got to power, they would recognise that Palestine is an independent sovereign state. I understand that is also SNP policy. And in fact, 138 countries have recognised that Palestine is an independent sovereign state. I wanted to talk about the action taken against children in the occupation. Arrested and detained. Sandra White and I, who were in Silwan, if you remember, many years ago, a child which we met, aged 3 years old, was detained by the IDF for throwing stones. Children are interrogated, taken from their parents during the night, and their parents are presented with documentation in Hebrew that they cannot understand. There are adolescents locked in Israeli jails where we don't know where they are. Their families have not heard from them for 10 and 15 years. Is this the kind of Israel that really you want to defend? I think it's quite shocking that you don't at least recognise the brutality of the occupation. 40% of minors are arrested in the public sphere simply for throwing stones. And probably most notably, Ahmed Tamimi, when she was 17, was arrested for slapping a soldier, sentenced to 18 months in jail. But remember, the soldier killed her cousin in front of her very eyes. Conclusion, Presiding Officer. I just wanted to mention that Ambassador Hassam Zimlaw has lettered all of the MSPs, and he says, it's a crucial moment in the history of the Palestine-Israel conflict, not just for Palestinians, but for Israelis too. The incumbent Israeli Prime Minister is facing an election which he openly advocates against the two-state solution, which is British foreign policy, Conservative policy, Labour policy, Liberal policy, and was US policy until very, very recently. As Claudia Beamish says, the UK has a unique and historic responsibility. The Balfour Declaration was clear. In the creation of the State of Israel, the rights of the indigenous population were to be protected. No such thing has happened in the last 5 decades. The only way for peace in the region is to recognise that Israel must be challenged to draw back from its occupation, which is illegal, and get round the table and create an independent Palestinian state. If you believe in any kind of fairness, that's what you'll support.
I now call John Finney to be followed by Alec Cole-Hamilton. Mr Finney, please.
Thank you very much indeed, Presiding Officer. And can I start by congratulating my friend and colleague, Claudia Beamish, for as ever, an excellent speech. And one of the phrases I noted from her speech was a just way forward. And I would hope that we would all be up for that. I really would. Certainly, Ambassador Zumlaut, in his letter to all of us, talks about living in peace, equality, freedom, and with the ability to enjoy their basic right of self-determination along with the other peoples of this world. Now, I have to say, that's not radical, that's mainstream thinking. There's nothing off the wall about that. That is the fundamental basis of liberal democracies, of international law, of basic humanitarian norms. And putting Mr. Moment, I understand that you didn't want to accept interventions. This is a debate. It's about discussing. I don't know the source of some of your information there, but if I quite often, and we've spoken in these countless debates, and if there's frustration in people's voices, it's because we are frustrated. I'm weary of saying the same things. I'll condemn violence from any quarter. Are you, Mr. Bowman, prepared to condemn violence from any quarter? No, you're not. You're not shaking your head. And there's the problem with this, because this isn't a contest. If this is how it's viewed, this is not a contest of equals. This is a heavily armed apartheid regime, and in every term of international law, this would be how it, and I see Mr. Mountain screw his face up, that is the terminology, that's exactly the same terminology that would apply to the oppressive regime in South Africa, and thank goodness we've progressed from there. Now, we only progress by having discussions. The peace that's come to the island of Ireland and is presently under threat as a result of your government is because people who... Yes, I will take an intervention, Mr. Mountain.
Edward Mountain.
Sorry, I take very grave exception to anyone that says that anyone should be promoting or accepting violence on any side. And I think the first thing, and I accept the point you made, Mr. Finney, that, Mr. Finney, I take the point you made, that the first thing to do is for both sides to disengage, stop fighting, stop firing bullets at each other, and stop killing each other. Now, once that happens, then we can move forward. That's what's happening in that's what happened in Northern Ireland, and we won't go back to the problems in Northern Ireland unless politicians make it a likelihood. And I don't believe any politician is trying to do that.
Well, before you respond, and I didn't want to intervene in a very emotional and quite rightly emotional debate, but you're using the term "you" frequently, and I'll let it pass a few times, but please remember the protocols in Parliament. Mr. Finney.
Apologies, Presiding Officer, and apologies to Mr. Mountain. You know, the paramedics that are shot and targeted at these protests, they're not shooting at anyone. The journalists, the photographic journalists who are covering these demonstrations, and that's what they are, the right to free assembly, their right to express opinion, they're posing a threat to no one. They're posing a threat to no one. So I have to say, I'm immediately running out of time. I had something of a speech prepared here. And I wanted to say it was a well-crafted motion. It laid out, I thought, in a very balanced way, a number of things. Very briefly, Britain has a historic responsibility. It is very well placed to bring about engagement. That engagement isn't selling arms. That engagement isn't turning a blind eye to the latest atrocity or having no comment to make. It's very, very important that we promote the universal values that it says here Britain helped enshrine. When did it help enshrine these? It helped enshrine these at the conclusion of the Second World War so that there would be no repetition of enclosed enclaves with people under attack as we have in the biggest prison in the world, which is going to be uninhabitable in a year, according to the UN. So, you know, collective punishment is illegal, and that's what's happening. I think that we all need to, and it's important that we engage in this chamber too there, because what little influence it may feel we have, I know that the Scottish Government do, and I commend the efforts and their willingness to engage in this and to raise this internationally. I think that is very, very important. You know, we must bring about a situation where children that we saw, Claudia Beamish and I, saw when we were in Gaza, there's a traumatised community. Now, this chamber, day in, day out, talks about adverse childhood experiences when we're talking about individuals and individual circumstances. This is an entire community that's had adverse experiences of that. We must address it. We're going to address it by talking. So I hope, when we speak next time, Mr. Bowman, I hope you'll accept interventions, because it is about debate that we're going to progress things. It's not by ignoring each other. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you very much. I call Alec Cole-Hamilton, to be followed by Richard Lyle. Mr. Lyle's the last speaker in the open debate. Mr. Cole-Hamilton, please.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. I'm too very grateful to Claudia Beamish for bringing such a well-crafted motion to the Parliament this afternoon. It is well-crafted. It threads the needle to allow all sides, I think, of this chamber to support it, and certainly the Liberal Democrats do this afternoon. Presiding Officer, one of the darkest legacies of the British Empire is the reality that there are lines drawn by British cartographers in maps around the world which spark conflicts to this day, and that carries with it a burden of atonement and redress that is handed down through the generations, as we as parliamentarians have a role to play in and at least trying to unpick some of that mess. And in nowhere is that cat's cradle greater than in the current state of affairs in Israel-Palestine. 3 treaties, each born of motives of profit, conquest and military alliance in wartime, have created that mess, and each of them have in some way created the state of affairs that has existed and created a state of conflict in that region for the better part of a century, whether that's the McMahon-Hussein Treaty or agreement in World War I, brokered in part by T.E. Lawrence to bring Arabia into the war against the Ottoman Empire, with the hint that they might have their own state and a unified state of Arabia with it. The Sykes-Picot Agreement that happened at the end of the war, which saw the victors of that war carving up for monetary gain aspects of the Middle East, drawing maps around oil wells and uniting, crashing peoples together, which have created states like Iraq and Syria. And then finally, the Balfour Declaration, as we've heard from Lord Rothschild, which was designed first and foremost to help bring America into World War II with the promise of a Jewish homeland state. Each of these treaties, seemingly vital to British interests at the time, effectively carved up the same piece of land and its peoples with no thought of the impact that that would have for those peoples or those lands for generation upon generation. And that legacy is measured out in human lives, in disproportionate violence and displacement that goes on to this very day. Between March and November last year, Israelis launched intermittent air and artillery attacks on the Gaza Strip, killing 37 Palestinians, while Palestinian groups fired over 1,000 rockets into Israel in the same period. I welcome the motion today and the questions it asks of what we in Scotland can do and must do. And as Lib Dems, we strongly believe that these two peoples, Israelis and Palestinians, are obliged to share this region forever. But it is part and parcel of our responsibility, our historic responsibility to the region, to help them to do that. We favour neither group over the other in that reality, and we look forward to recognising a wholly autonomous and sovereign Palestinian state when it will lead to a workable and sustainable two-state solution. We condemn the disproportionate use of force on both sides, whether that's rocket attacks by Palestinians or the Israelis' continuing illegal policy of settlement expansion. The morass of Israel-Palestine and all the suffering that goes with it is the dark inheritance of our history, and we need to play a part in its future. Thank you.
Richard Lyle, please.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. This should not be a debate of blame because we support a position or a state, but a debate of solutions. Can I thank Claudia Beamish for securing this debate on Palestine tonight, and I listened intently to her Scottish plan. I'll cover some of the points, but again I am reminded that the Scottish Government supports a two-state solution, as do I. Two states, two governments, Jews and Palestinians working together for peace in a region, peace which is long overdue. As the Deputy Convener of the cross-party group of Building Bridges with Israel, I can only say that the CPG I joined would be very happy to hold a joint meeting with the CPG on Palestine in this Parliament to discuss solutions. And I say to Claudia Beamish, I hope she and others accept my request. In a recent visit to Palestine, I took the opportunity, yes I will,
John Finney. Well, that was a not very polite request, but yes, you will get your time back. John Finney.
Thank you, President Officer. I'm very grateful for Mr Lyle accepting that my intervention. And in the normal course of things, having said what I've said about dialogue, yes, but I wonder would Mr Lyle accept that it's perhaps unfortunate that some of the people who attend the cross-party group in Palestine would feel uncomfortable, extremely uncomfortable, perhaps even under threat by attending that group, and that's extremely unfortunate.
Richard Lyle.
Well, I'm sure I would not feel threatened attending any cross-party group, and I'm sure people, if we're going to say that we need to find a solution, you know, as we put forward this debate, we must be at least able to talk to each other, and that's the point I want to make tonight. You know, we've got to speak. You know, and I could speak, when I went on the visit, I could speak to anybody in Israel, and I spoke in the West Bank regarding the current situation in the region. I spoke to both ordinary Jews, Palestinians, and they all say they wanted peace. They want to live in peace and cooperation. I saw that cooperation in an organisation that we visited. The manager was Jewish, the deputy was Palestinian, and they worked together. We also visited Palestinian city being built at Rawabi in the West Bank. This was an excellent project funded by Palestinians, and I wish them well in the project. As fellow members know, my questions are very often direct. And I done a meeting with a senior member of the Israeli government. I told him directly I supported the two-nation solution. His direct answer to me, and I quote, "So do we, Mr Lyle." We also had the opportunity to visit Jerusalem, and I saw for myself arrangements for different faiths to worship. I believe there should be true freedom of worship for all believers, Jewish, Muslim, Christians, and at their holy sites. That's what I believe in. Israel has accepted the UN Security Council Resolution 242 and made peace with both Egypt and Jordan based on it. Israel has in fact offered blueprints for a two-state solution between itself and the Palestinians, including the Camp David Summit and the 2007 Summit. recognise the Palestinian state without it arising from direct negotiations between the two parties will harm the peace process and drive the Palestinians away from the negotiation table. Anyone who claims to support a two-state solution must support a return to direct negotiations, which is the only way to guarantee a peaceful, secure and prosperous future. No, I've got something to say, and I want to say it. I want to say it. The British in 1947, caused this. This was a recipe for disaster, and you only need to go on the internet and see the recipe for disaster, the way they cut up Palestine. My goodness. And we are having to, there have been so many plans, rejected. Gaza Strip, the Saudi Arabia, the Benjamin Ellen plan, I'll rattle through this, Presiding Officer, the Ark, which the West Bank was joined with Gaza, the West Bank split, the secular Arab state Palestinian National Covenant, the federal separate Jewish and Arab areas, the United Arab Kingdom plan. All these plans have been rejected. The problem, no, it's no rubbish, it's true. It's true. The problems in the region go back decades. I'll finish. Many have tried to solve the problems. Numerous American presidents, many meetings, Camp David, on the law. You know, you don't want to listen. That's the problem. You know,
sit down, Mr. Lyle. Sit down, Mr. Lyle. Sit down, please, a moment. You can't conduct a debate by shouting across the chamber. Whether you're frustrated or not is not the way it's to conduct it. Mr. Lyle, please conclude.
Thank you, Presiding Officer. I want a two-state solution. I want to work with anyone, anywhere, to afford peace to both Palestinians and Jews in one of the regions which deserves peace. So I say to Claudia Beanish, thank you for the opportunity to say, let our CPGs work together and show what we can do to bring peace. If you can't do that, well, we can't do anything. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
Right, thank you very much. I now call on Fiona Hislop to close the debate for the Government. Cabinet Secretary, please.
Presiding Officer, I welcome this debate to call for action towards an independent Palestine. The calls for freedom of belief for all people, respect of human rights and respect for the rule of law, accountability and recognition of the State of Palestine alongside Israel. I would also like to thank Claudia Beamish for raising this motion in the Parliament this evening and putting it in its historic context. I would also like to take forward my remarks by taking the 6 measures mentioned in the motion in order. On the closure of Gaza, the Scottish Government strongly encourages both the Israeli Government and the Palestinian Authority to prioritise a sustainable solution for Gaza that includes practical steps to ensure the reconstruction and economic recovery of Gaza. The current situation where Palestinians are trapped within Gaza, but also in a cycle of violence, should not be allowed to continue. UN figures state that in 2018, 260 Palestinians were killed in Gaza, with a further 65 killed so far this year. The border at Gaza needs to be reopened. According to an Oxfam report last year, unemployment rates in Gaza at 42% were amongst the highest in the world. 96% of water is undrinkable. Access to electricity and medicine is severely restricted. A tolerant world should not allow a situation like this to develop. The end of the blockade of Gaza needs to go hand in hand with a cessation of violence. And this includes Hamas in Gaza, who need to commit to an end to attacks. UN figures show 14 Israelis killed by Palestinians last year, with a further 8 deaths this year. Violence on both sides must end. On freedom of worship, the right to worship freely is a key human right. And peace in the Middle East is dependent on communities being free to pursue their religious beliefs. Without religious tolerance, there can be no long-term peace. And I include the practice of Christianity in Israel, which is a key issue that's been raised by my constituents with me. Peace in the region is only possible if everyone is treated equally, no matter their beliefs, their ethnicity or their gender. We aspire for Scotland to act as a good global citizen, drawing on our own experience at home to promote tolerance and respect for human rights in other countries. People of all faiths and none must be supported to follow their way of life
without fear of discrimination. On respect of the rule of law, with rights become responsibilities. Peace and a tolerant society will only exist where the human rights of all are respected and there is a respect for the rule of law. This must be at the heart of any solution, ensuring that a just and lasting peace can be maintained. On accountability, the rule of law can only be respected where there is accountability. Security forces and the police, the government and its institutions must be held to account. With no accountability, there can be no real trust. Without trust, there can be no real peace. On recognition of the State of Palestine, the Scottish Government, in line with other governments in Europe, supports a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders. More than 130 countries, as we've heard, around the world have already formally recognised the State of Palestine. And on the 15th of May 2018, I wrote to the UK encouraging them to do so at the UN, but as yet, as we know, they have not done so. Officially recognising the State of Palestine would send a clear signal that the rights of the people of Palestine to self-determination are recognised. We firmly encourage both Israel and Palestine to reach a sustainable and, yes, negotiated settlement under international law, which has at its foundation mutual recognition and the determination to coexist peacefully. Despite considerable diplomatic efforts in the past, the two-state solution has practical barriers. The construction of illegal settlements continues to be tolerated, even encouraged by the Government of Israel. And continuing plans for new settlements in the West Bank and the retroactive approval of unauthorised settlements undermines stability and the viability of a two-state solution. Official recognition would make clear the expectations on a responsible, independent Palestinian nation-state. Palestine should aspire to the standards in terms of respect for human rights, for the integrity of its neighbours, and the sanctity of the lives of their people. The people of Palestine should not allow their territories to be used by those who seek the destruction of Israel. The people of Israel deserve to live free from the scourge of terrorism and anti-Semitic incitement, which gravely undermines the prospects for a two-state solution. We believe that peace depends on there being two secure, stable and prosperous states of Israel and Palestine living side by side. Accepting Palestine as a state in its own right alongside Israel should be the starting point of negotiations. Within Scotland, the Scottish Government does not tolerate violence or extremism in any form. Just as we condemn it when directed at our own communities, we condemn it in Israel and Palestine. We believe it is long overdue for a lasting resolution that ends the settlement expansion and delivers peace for both Israelis and Palestinians. The UK needs to use its influence to work with the international community and global institutions to help secure a lasting peace in the region. This can only be achieved by taking a human rights-based approach, by respecting the rights of all who live in the region, and by pushing for a two-state solution where rights are respected. We have consistently condemned obstacles to progress in the peace process, like the indiscriminate rocket attacks on Israel or the continued expansion of illegal settlements in the occupied territories. We have also repeatedly called on the UK Government to use its influence to help revitalise the peace process, finding a way to break through the political deadlock and bring an end to the conflict. Presiding Officer, I'd like to commend the work of the Balfour Project to educate us all about the underlying causes of the Israel-Palestinian conflict. In conclusion, the Scottish Government strongly encourages the Israeli Government and the Palestinian Authority to work with the international community on securing long-term peace and ending the cycle of conflict which continues to affect both Palestinians and Israelis. The Scottish Government supports the EU position of a two-state solution based on the 1967 borders and firmly encourages both Palestine and Israel to reach a sustainable negotiated settlement under international law, which as its foundation has mutual recognition and the determination to coexist peacefully. We will continue to press the UK Government to do all it can to work with international partners to actively work to secure peace in Israel and Palestine. A tolerant world can demand no less. And, Presiding Officer, in this chamber and in Scotland, I want to see a tolerant debate with understanding. I think that we owe that to those that we seek to have something similar in terms of their resolution and perhaps we should start with ourselves in this chamber.
Thank you very much, Cabinet Secretary, and that concludes the debate, and I close this meeting of Parliament.